Every human being carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. We spend our lives building a fortress of moral certainty, wearing polished masks to convince the world, and more importantly ourselves, that we are fundamentally good. But beneath the manicured surface of civility lies a submerged continent of forgotten desires, banished rage, and unspeakable impulses. Carl Gustav Jung called this hidden domain the shadow. It is not merely a metaphor for bad behavior, it is an autonomous force, a psychological double that hungers for expression. To ignore it is not to destroy it, but to grant it absolute authority over your fate. As Jung starkly warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate.
The tragedy of the shadow did not begin in a sterile laboratory, but in the crucible of a world tearing itself apart at the seams. In the early 20th century, Western civilization was drunk on the illusion of endless rationality and moral progress. Then came the slaughterhouse of World War I. Millions of civilized men butchered one another in mud-drenched trenches. The myth of human nobility shattered overnight. Jung witnessed this collective descent into madness, not as an external anomaly, but as a psychic epidemic. Humanity had projected its own repressed violence onto the enemy, convincing itself that evil resided entirely outside its borders. The catastrophe demonstrated a terrifying truth. The most dangerous weapon in existence is not the artillery shell, but the unacknowledged dark side of the human psyche. For Jung himself, discovering the shadow was a personal descent into hell. His rupture with Sigmund Freud in 1913 was a devastating divorce that shattered his identity. Freud had viewed the unconscious as a mere basement for repressed sexual traumas, but Jung sensed something far more ancient and dangerous lurking in the depths. Stripped of his mentor and isolated by the psychoanalytic community, Jung plunged into a profound mental crisis. He suffered from overwhelming hallucinations and visions of blood-soaking Europe. "My soul was like a graveyard of dead dreams," Jung later reflected during this period of exile. To survive his own psychological disintegration, he began recording his waking nightmares in what would become the Red Book, confronting the terrifying monsters, demons, and dark figures inhabiting his inner world. He realized that to fight these internal horrors was to feed them. The only way through the darkness was absolute, terrifying surrender to self-knowledge. This obsessive quest for psychic truth extracted a brutal toll on Jung's personal relationships, blurring the lines between love, betrayal, and psychological experimentation. His long-suffering wife, Emma Jung, was forced to endure his complex emotional relationship with Tony Wolff, a former patient who became his muse and shadow companion. Jung insisted that Emma represented his earthly stability, while Tony embodied his contact with the deep, untamed abyss of the unconscious. He forced an agonizing triangle upon them, dragging the women he loved into the shadow realm of his own split personality. Tony Wolff lived in the perpetual twilight of being the unacknowledged second wife, consumed by the dark archetypes they analyzed together, while Emma was forced to bear the silent humiliation of a husband who refused to conform to conventional morality. Jung believed that there is no coming to consciousness without pain, but much of that pain was borne by those who loved him, sacrificed on the altar of his psychological revelation. The mechanism of the shadow operates through the insidious magic of projection. What we cannot accept in ourselves, we hate with burning intensity in others. The moralist is secretly haunted by the vice he condemns. The tyrant is driven by a hidden, terrified weakness. When an individual refuses to acknowledge their personal dark side, they project it outward, onto their partners, their colleagues, or entire social groups. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, Jung wrote. In intimate relationships, this dynamic becomes poison. The passionate lover transforms into a ruthless prosecutor, blaming their partner for the very insecurities, resentments, and cruelties they refuse to see in their own mirror. Relationships crumble, not because love dies, but because the shadow self takes the wheel, turning intimacy into a battleground of unconfessed sins. As Friedrich Nietzsche famously declared, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. In the modern 21st century, the shadow has found its ultimate amplifier, the digital ecosystem. We live in an era of hyper-curated personas, where social media demands the continuous broadcast of a flawless, virtuous self. But the human psyche cannot sustain absolute purity. The more we perform righteousness online, the more potent and ravenous the collective shadow becomes. It manifests in the vicious reflex of outrage culture, public cancellations, and the anonymous cruelty that flourishes in comment sections. We look at the screens in our hands and see a mirror, but we refuse to recognize the monster staring back. As Marie-Louise von France, Jung's closest collaborator, observed, the shadow is not simply a flaw, it is the essential raw material from which consciousness is forged. When we deny our personal dark side, we become susceptible to collective psychoses. History shows that whenever a society believes it is absolute good fighting absolute evil, mass atrocities are never far behind. We carry our own darkness, and when we fail to recognize it, we project it onto the political opponent, the foreigner, the dissenter, wrote Erich Neumann. By demonizing the other, we grant ourselves permission to commit the very atrocities we claim to despise. The modern ideological wars raging across our cultural landscape are nothing more than the unexamined shadow playing out on a global stage. Integrating the shadow is not an act of submission to evil. It is an act of total, unsparing honesty. It requires looking into the darkest corners of your character and admitting that under the right circumstances, you too could be the villain.
One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung insisted, but by making the darkness conscious. The dark side contains vital energy, creativity, instinct, and strength that have been locked away out of fear. Without the shadow, a human being remains a fragile, bloodless caricature of goodness, incapable of real courage, because courage requires an intimate acquaintance with danger. To achieve true wholeness, one must forge a contract with their own darkness. Until you face the monstrous aspects of your own nature, your goodness is merely an accident of circumstance, a lack of opportunity rather than a moral choice. The ultimate challenge of human existence is not to become pure, but to become whole.